do a little bit of research on the history of Easter each time it rolls around. And so I'm going to share a little bit of that with you. So Easter, or Pascha, which is the Greek word for Passover, as it's called in Latin and Greek, is a defining holy day of Christianity. You wouldn't necessarily know that in our society because we make such a big deal out of Christmas. And Easter is sort of on the side, but in fact, Easter is the day. In alignment with gospel accounts, it was connected to the Jewish holidays of Passover, the festival that Jesus and his disciples had come to Jerusalem to celebrate. But the connection goes beyond the position of the calendar, as both these holidays also share much of the same symbolism. In essence, the birth and rebirth that are associated with the season of spring, as well as the Hebrews' journey from slavery to freedom, from Egypt to the Promised Land, which is mirrored in the Christian tradition of Jesus' resurrection, freeing us from the bondage of death. The dates of Passover, the 14th day of the Jewish month of Nisan, are set in Leviticus, the third book of the Torah, probably written in post-exile around 500 before BCE, before the Common Era, when much of the ancient oral tradition was finally scribed. This year, Passover, which began just this past Friday, directly overlaps with our Easter celebration because Passover goes on for 7 days. There's direct evidence of an established Christian festival of Pascha aligned with Passover by the mid-2nd century. So by 150 of the Common Era, there was already an established Easter celebration going on. However, our current robing dates for Easter was established in 325 Common Era by the Council of Nicaea, when it was officially separated from the Jewish lunar calendar and set for the first Sunday after the first full moon following the spring equinox. Did you ever wonder how it gets moved around? Well, there it is. That's the and that was based on the Julian calendar that was established in about 46 before the Common Era. The shift from the Jewish lunar calendar to the Roman sun calendar is why the dates often vary now. While Passover and Easter are always in the same spring time period, they're not always exactly aligned. Then, I learned a lot of interesting things. In 1582, Pope Gregory adopted the Gregorian calendar, which is the calendar we still use today, in order to maintain the Easter Pascha celebration in the spring. The Julian calendar included too many leap days, causing the holy day of Easter to be gradually shifting away from spring, and that concerned the Pope. And so he called his scientists, and they figured out a more accurate way to measure so that Easter would stay in the springtime. We also know that the Jewish calendar has an extra month that gets put in every couple of years so that it will keep Passover during the spring. I share all of this to establish first just how ancient the celebrations of Passover and Easter are, unlike the relatively recent 19th century tradition for Christmas. And second, how these ancient sacred traditions are inextricably connected with the earth's sacred cycles of birth, life, death, and rebirth. And while it's often taught that the church aligned its holy days with existing pagan festivals in order to encourage the wider acceptance of Christianity, I've taught that myself, I now believe it was also due to the awareness and acknowledgement of these early leaders of the earth's sacredness, a truth that was much later rejected by the church, but gratefully is now being reclaimed. Many of you may have heard of Pope Francis' encyclical from 2015 on the environment, where he says that Christians have misinterpreted Scripture for eons and the meaning of dominion over the earth. That takes us back to our prevailing theme this year, concerning how we're being called to imagine and embrace a new story, a new dream about humanity's role within creation, replacing our current narrative of separation, domination, and exploitation with one of interbeing, beneficial cooperation, and collective sustainability. As I've also shared, however, as convinced as I am that we are being called to imagine this new story and dream, because life happens from the inside out, so if we can't hold the story, we can't bring it into demonstration. I also shared that I have not been experiencing a lot of success with that, and I got some agreement from other folks that it's a challenging call. And then, if you recall, a few weeks ago, I touched into a thin place when I saw the music Hamilton, which has literally changed and shifted my perspective and my being, from focusing on changing our outer story and dream about how the world looks to surrendering into the grace of God. And I'll tell you that that transformation is still in progress. It's no accident that all of this has occurred during the season of Lent and Easter, which is all about releasing that which distracts us from the truth so that we may be resurrected into new life. So, how many of you were here last Wednesday night for the Sea Change environmental program? I think we had 15 or 16 people there. It was quite a wake-up call, right? For those of you who weren't here, we had two scientists presenting who gave us a pretty dark perspective on the state of our Earth and the likelihood, according to science, that we're going to be able to turn things around. You know how in Unity we don't like to focus too much on Good Friday, that crucifixion element of the Easter story? Partly because the traditional teaching that Jesus died for our sins doesn't align with our understanding of a loving God. And partly because we're oriented to focus on the bright side of life. We even sing songs about that. In essence, God's good all the time. Well, those of us who attended last Wednesday's program were perhaps unwittingly immersed in a worldly hopelessness not unlike the darkness and despair symbolized by Good Friday. True? In fact, as people left, clearly feeling despondent, in fact, there was going to be another program and the majority of people left just from the heaviness of the presentation. I stood at the door reminding them that Easter is coming and that resurrection always follows crucifixion. Now, I admit in that moment, I wasn't sure what this resurrection would look like or how I was going to prepare a lesson or a talk this morning to invoke such a transforming experience. I did, however, trust in the depths of my being that it would come, and I would be guided as to what to say. Because in Unity, we understand that crucifixion and resurrection can't be understood in isolation from one another. In that together they represent the natural order, the divine design for all living, evolving beings, and more generally for life itself, as demonstrated in our cycle of seasons. The synoptic Gospels of Mark, Matthew, and Luke describe several instances of Jesus preparing his disciples for his coming, suffering, death, and ultimate crucifixion. But they always included the promise that he would be raised in 3 days. And the Gospel of John portrays Jesus preparing the disciples for his glorification by comparing it to this natural order, saying, "The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Very truly, I tell you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains just a single grain. But if it dies, it bears much fruit." Well, like everything about Jesus' life and teachings, we can apply this truth to our own lives. Crucifixion, metaphysically, represents the crossing out of error states of minds, including, as I said earlier, habits that distract us from the truth, up to and including the surrender or death of the whole personality, in order that the Christ mind may be expressed in all its fullness, as it was in Jesus. We all experience multiple crucifixions in our lives. Every time we cancel or release old beliefs that have defined and limited us, thereby growing in spiritual maturity and Christ consciousness, we're being resurrected. Before we can take on greater good, we must let go of what no longer serves us. At first, this letting go often appears involuntary, as if someone or even life itself is taking something from us, forcing us into change. Anybody ever feel that way?
Yeah.
For example, the loss of a loved one, the loss of a job or a home or our health. Given our human aversion to change, we often resist and delay crucifixions. We remain in toxic relationships or unfulfilling jobs just out of the fear of the unknown. We'd rather stay in known pain rather than step into the unknown and go through a crucifixion. But life is designed to move us forward, whether we're willing or not. As the saying goes, the only thing constant in life is change. But for every crucifixion, there's a resurrection into new life, into new understanding. And if we're paying attention, hindsight often reveals the divine order of things. We discover life-transforming gifts in some of our greatest challenges. Most of us, I think, would ultimately recognize that many changes we would have never chosen ended up being the best thing that could have happened, right? And with each resurrection, we ascend a bit in consciousness, gaining wisdom and insights that can shift our whole perspective. And in essence, it feels like a whole new life. We're no longer bound to those beliefs and limitations that had controlled us before. When we finally realize that life happens through us and not to us, we're able to embrace life's crucifixions and resurrections more graciously and with less suffering, but not necessarily with less pain. In fact, I find that the higher consciousness correlates with greater compassion, and that inevitably involves more pain, but also more joy, more peace, more love, more laughter, more everything positive as well. Jesus modeled this process for us in the extreme. I don't believe that he knew for certain that his entry into Jerusalem would result in his crucifixion, but he had to know it was a possibility, and he went anyway, graciously, lovingly, and forgivingly. And we've seen others model that behavior. Martin Luther King, Mahatma Gandhi, they followed in the footsteps of Jesus and stepped out in truth, not knowing what might happen, but willing to risk. Jesus' first word from the cross was, "Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do." And his last word was, "It is finished." The release was complete. I also don't believe that he knew for certain what would come next. He was human, just like us, only more evolved. So based on his faith, he had a trust in what would come next, but he didn't know any more than any of us do. He trusted, however, his experience of God's all-encompassing love and surrender. And that allowed the love that he had embodied to continue transforming the world for the past 2+ millennia and counting. I think those of us that stayed for the small group encounter last Wednesday night, following the gut punch presentation, experienced a kind of resurrection. I know I did. There were no magical answers offered to assuage the disheartening facts that had been offered. We were simply invited to sit in the process, in essence, to embrace the crucifixion, share our fears and our feelings with one another, and ultimately consider this question: so if the worst happens, who will you be in the midst of it? I found that a most illuminating question that is staying in my mind now. It was a transforming experience similar to being in hospice with someone, accepting the natural order of life and death while focusing on the emotional and spiritual meanings and needs of the moment. We collectively surrendered into not knowing, as we all affirm that the answers won't come from the same level of consciousness that created this mess we're in. I later realized that the answers that do come probably won't answer the questions that we have right now. They'll be answers to a whole new understanding and imagination. In short, the experience moved me from my head to my heart, from my brain reacting to the facts to my heart breaking open in compassion. And in that, I experienced the uplifting power of being fully present in the moment, connecting with a group of caring people, all of us authentically witnessing what is, in essence, surrendering into God's grace. I felt and feel more peaceful, centered, grounded than I have in some time. And again, it's still a work in progress. So Easter gives us this opportunity to consciously practice and embrace this crucifixion and resurrection process that repeats itself over and over in our lives. And as we've discussed for many years, it's not really about Jesus' resurrection. Rather, it's about each of us being willing to crucify that which stands in the way of knowing the truth of who we are, so that Christ consciousness can more fully resurrect in and as us. For me, given where our world currently stands, I need to crucify fear. As imagined in climate change and the political insanity of our times and all of the other current issues that are ultimately out of my control. As well as crucifying all of the distracting habits I've developed to avoid that fear. Anybody relate to that? We do. Humans are great at creating distractions so that we don't have to face what is. I truly don't know what's going to happen in our world, and nor do the scientists. But I do know that we can't fix anything at the same level of fear consciousness we're currently inhabiting. Because every solution seems to bring with it just more problems. And I know that as in compassion, I know that love, as in compassion, integrity, kindness, respect, responsibility, forgiveness, and caring, trumps fear, transforms lives without unintended negative consequences, and raises consciousness for all concerned. So, in my Easter resurrection, I've gotten the answer to the question, if the worst happens, who will I be? And it's the same as my answer to the question, what is mine to do right now? And it's the same as was in the video. Show up as love. Do what is good and right and truthful. Grounded in the ever-expanding, ever-renewing, unlimited power of God's grace. Namaste. And happiness. So on Easter, many of you know, we do communion, rather than that becomes our meditation process. And so as we celebrate finding God in the world, in our human story, and in history, and in ourselves, it's especially appropriate that we engage in this sacred ritual of communion. Sacred from the word consecrate, or holy dedication. Ritual meaning an outward and visible sign of an inward and spiritual grace. In essence, engaging our whole being, mind, body, and soul, in our desire to experience communion. In essence, oneness with God and God's universal community. The word Eucharist actually comes from the Greek words for thanksgiving and grateful, which come from the root word for grace, in essence, the universal bias for good in life. In unity, we bring a different interpretation to the traditional Christian ritual, one that represents our understanding of the teachings of Jesus rather than the religion about him. Specifically, we honor Jesus' practice of inclusive table fellowship that includes the giving and receiving of forgiveness, our gratitude for God's abundant supply that sustains us, and particularly at Easter, our individual awakening into Christ consciousness, the realization of our universal oneness, expressing in our lives and in the world as divine love, wisdom, justice, and peace. As we reflect on our mystical tradition, we begin with spiritual communion, which actually occurs every time we honor our sacred connection with God, whether in a daily moment of prayer or in a special Holy Day celebration. And we follow that with a ritual or sharing of a common meal as an outward and visible sign of our commitment to love one another, which is the essence of Christ consciousness. And so we prepare ourselves for every sacred engagement through purification, opening our hearts and minds to the healing, cleansing, unifying power of Spirit. And we follow it